There is a photograph taken on Market Street in downtown San Francisco on a weekday afternoon in the last few years. The light is clean, the sky is the particular pale blue that hangs over the bay, and the towers rise on either side, glass and steel, the headquarters of companies whose names are typed into search bars billions of times a day. And the street beneath them is nearly empty. A shuttered flagship store with paper over the windows. A transit station with more staff than passengers. A sidewalk where, at the hour that should be the beating heart of the workday, almost no one is walking at all. That image confused people, because this was supposed to be the richest city of the modern age, the capital of the future, the place where the next century was being invented. Now understand what that photograph actually showed. It was not a city in a temporary slump. It was a city discovering something about itself that it had spent 50 years carefully not noticing. That the wealth it produced and the place it occupied had quietly come apart. That the fortune was still being made, in record amounts, on screens and in code and in equity. But the city itself, the physical streets and shops and stations, was no longer necessary to making it, and the official story is that this is just a rough patch, a post-pandemic adjustment, a city that will bounce back, as it always has. But that is not what is actually happening. Because the people and the money did not leave San Francisco because of one bad few years. They left because San Francisco accidentally proved that it could be left. And what is replacing the daily life of the city, or rather what is not replacing it, tells a story that goes far beyond empty offices and boarded windows. This is the story of a city that became so good at producing wealth that the wealth stopped needing the city, a place that built the very tools that made its own physical existence optional, and then watched, with a kind of stunned disbelief, as people used those tools to walk away. If you have been watching this city carefully, you already sense that something does not add up, that the headlines about collapse and the headlines about record fortunes cannot both be true, and yet somehow are. And if you want to understand why the richest city of the technological age is quietly hollowing out from the inside, subscribe. Empire Falls documents the decline that the people getting rich are the least able to see. San Francisco has always lived on booms. That is the thing most people forget. The city did not grow slowly, organically, over centuries the way old European capitals did. It exploded into existence almost overnight in 1849, when gold was found in the hills and the world rushed in. It was a boomtown from its first breath, a place built not to be lived in carefully but to be struck rich and quickly. And that original character never really left. Every few decades, a new kind of gold appeared. The rush always came, and every time, the city filled with people chasing the same dream, the dream that here, more than anywhere on earth, an ordinary person could arrive with nothing and leave transformed. The last and greatest of those rushes was technology. Over a few short decades, the region around San Francisco became the single most concentrated engine of wealth creation in human history. The companies that grew up here did not just make money. They rewired how the entire species communicates, shops, works, and thinks. The fortunes generated were so large they distorted everything around them: salaries, rents, the price of a small house, the cost of a cup of coffee. For a while it looked like the purest success story imaginable. The smartest people on earth, in the most beautiful city in America, getting unimaginably rich by building the future. The numbers are clinical and worth stating plainly. The San Francisco region became one of the wealthiest places on the planet by income per person, generating economic output that rivaled entire nations. Home prices climbed to among the highest in the United States, with a modest house costing well over $1 million. And yet, in the space of just a few years, the city's downtown office vacancy rate climbed from almost nothing to roughly a third of all space sitting empty. The city lost a significant share of its population in a very short period, one of the steepest urban declines in the country. Public transit ridership into the downtown core fell off a cliff and did not come back. The richest city of the age was, by several of the most basic measures of a functioning city, emptying out, because here is the thing the success story never explained. The wealth of San Francisco was always strangely detached from the physical place. The gold in 1849 was in the ground, real, heavy, located. But the wealth of the technology era lived somewhere else entirely. It lived in lines of code, in stock options, in the valuation of companies whose actual product was information moving through the air. For decades, That wealth happened to be produced by people sitting in offices in a particular city. And so the city captured the spillover, the restaurants, the bars, the shops, the rents, the entire ecosystem that grows up around a place where high-earning people spend their days. But the connection between the wealth and the city was never essential. It was incidental. And incidental connections can be broken. What makes this more than an economic story is what broke it, because the thing that severed the wealth from the city was a tool the city itself had built. For years, the engineers of San Francisco had been constructing the infrastructure of remote everything: the video calls, the cloud documents, the messaging platforms, the entire apparatus that lets work happen anywhere there is a connection. They built it to sell to the world. They did not quite notice that they had also built the escape hatch from their own city. And when circumstances finally forced everyone to use those tools at once, a quiet, world-changing discovery was made. The work still got done, the fortunes still got made, and a great many of the people making them realized, all at once, that they did not actually need to be in San Francisco to do it. There is a particular kind of resident who made San Francisco what it was. And it was not only the founder or the famous investor. It was the high-earning ordinary worker, the engineer, the designer, the product manager, the person who paid the enormous rent because the job required being there, and who, in paying it, sustained the entire visible economy of the city. That resident is the one who left. Not because they stopped earning. Because they stopped needing to be there to earn. And once they did the arithmetic, once they compared a $1 million house and a chaotic street against the same salary, earned from somewhere cheaper, calmer, and sunnier, a great many of them quietly packed up. The wealth did not vanish. It dispersed. And a city, whose entire physical economy was built on the daily presence of those workers, discovered that presence was the one thing it could no longer guarantee. And this is where it becomes more unsettling. Because the decline of San Francisco is not simply a story about San Francisco. It is a story about a pattern. One that appears whenever a place becomes a host for a kind of wealth that does not truly belong to it. A city attracts an industry. The industry generates enormous spillover. The city comes to depend on that spillover for its restaurants, its shops, its tax base, its very life. And then the industry, for reasons of its own, no longer needs to be physically present. And the spillover stops, and the city is left with the infrastructure of a prosperity that has moved on without it. Detroit lived a version of this when the car industry it hosted no longer needed to build everything in one place. Company towns across the world have lived it. San Francisco is simply the richest and most advanced case, the one where the hosted wealth was the largest, and the means of its departure were the most complete. If patterns like this fascinate you, hit the like button. It tells the algorithm this kind of investigation deserves to stay visible. The history of how the city reached this point is, in its own way, a story of success curdling into fragility. For decades, San Francisco made a series of choices that each made sense on its own and combined into a trap. It allowed its wealth to concentrate in a single industry, until that industry was not one of its strengths, but the whole foundation. It made building new housing so difficult and so slow that prices detached entirely from what ordinary people could pay, hollowing out the teachers, the nurses, the service workers, the artists, everyone who is not paid in stock options. And it allowed its downtown to become a monoculture, an enormous district built almost entirely around the daily commute of office workers, with little life of its own once those workers went home. A city built like that is extraordinarily efficient at capturing a boom. It is also extraordinarily exposed when the boom changes shape. A downtown that exists only to receive commuters has nothing to fall back on when the commuters stop coming. There are no families living above the shops, because there are no apartments, only offices. There is no evening life because everyone drove home or rode the train back to a distant suburb. And so when the offices emptied, the district did not simply lose some business. It lost its only reason to be occupied at all. The shops closed because the foot traffic vanished. The foot traffic vanished because the offices emptied. The offices emptied because the work moved into the air. Each link pulled down the next. The city had a name for it: the doom loop. What the boom years quietly produced alongside the fortunes was the second layer of the pattern, the layer the celebratory profiles of brilliant founders never mention. The same concentration of extreme wealth that made the city rich also made it brutally unequal. and that inequality settled into the streets in the most visible way imaginable. While fortunes were being made in the towers, the sidewalks below, filled with people who had been priced entirely out of any kind of stable life, and with a drug crisis that turned certain blocks into open scenes of suffering that the wealthiest city in the country seemed unable or unwilling to solve. Overdose deaths in the city climbed to record highs. A city that could build software used by billions could not, it seemed, keep its own streets safe and livable because the wealth that might have addressed it was abstract, mobile, and increasingly disengaged from the physical place where the suffering was happening. The fortune and the crisis existed in the same square mile and barely touched. The testimony from inside the city is consistent, and when people speak honestly, rather than for the record, remarkably candid. A small business owner who ran a cafe downtown for over a decade described the change in terms that were difficult to argue with. The whole thing, she said, ran on the rhythm of the office workers. Morning coffee, lunch rush, after work drinks. That rhythm was the city, as far as my business was concerned. And one day it just did not come back. The towers are still there. The companies are still worth more than ever. But the people do not come down to the street anymore. And the street is what I sold to. You cannot run a city on companies that are doing fine without their workers physically present. The buildings are full of value and empty of people. And a downtown that is full of value and empty of people is not a downtown. It is a stranded asset with a beautiful view. This observation cuts to something deeper than commercial real estate. It cuts to the question of what a city is actually for. A city, historically, is a place where people are physically together, because being together is how things get made, how deals get done, how culture and commerce and human connection generate something that cannot happen at a distance. San Francisco built, with extraordinary brilliance, the technology that makes physical togetherness optional, and in doing so it undermined the most fundamental premise of urban life itself. The premise that you have to be here. When you no longer have to be here, the only reasons left to be here are the things a city offers beyond work: beauty, safety, community, joy, the texture of daily life. And those were precisely the things San Francisco, in its single-minded pursuit of the boom, had allowed to erode. And beneath all of it sits a problem that no quarter of strong earnings can disguise. Because it is not about money at all. It is about belief. The thing that made San Francisco magnetic for a century and a half was a belief. The belief that this was the place where the future happened and where an ordinary person could be transformed by being part of it. That belief is what pulled the gold miners, the dreamers, the engineers. And belief, once it cracks, is very hard to restore. When the brightest young people who once would have moved to San Francisco without a second thought begin to ask whether it is worth the cost, the chaos, and the price of a closet-sized apartment, when they begin to suspect that the future they want to build can be built just as well from somewhere else, the city loses the one resource it could never manufacture and never buy back: the pull, the sense that this here is where it is happening. What comes next is the question that no one in the official apparatus of the city wants to engage with honestly. The projections are not really secret. A city with a third of its downtown empty, a tax base built on that downtown, a population that has fallen, a cost of living that still excludes everyone who is not paid in equity, and an industry that has proven it can prosper without being physically present, is a city facing a reckoning that no single boom can fully reverse. It will not collapse in a cinematic sense. There will be no one date that historians can point to and say that is when San Francisco ended. It will be quieter than that. The flagship store that closes and is never replaced. The family that moves to a cheaper, calmer state and never moves back. The brilliant young engineer who chooses Austin or Miami or simply their own hometown with a remote job. The train that runs half empty into a downtown that has forgotten how to be full. San Francisco will not become a ghost town. The Bay is too beautiful. The wealth too immense. The pull of its own legend too strong for that. There are already signs of a new rush, a fresh wave of ambition around artificial intelligence, drawing some of the energy back. And that is real, and it may revive parts of the city. But it is worth noticing that this is exactly the pattern repeating. Another boom arriving to paper over the unsolved fragility beneath. Another rush of concentrated wealth that may once again detach from the physical city, the moment it no longer needs it. The booms have always come to San Francisco. The question the city has never been forced to answer until now is what it is in the quiet years between them, when the gold has moved on and only the place remains. The people who live there know it. You do not need a long conversation with a longtime resident, or a shop owner, or a worker who watched their neighborhood empty out, to understand that they are living in a city in a strange suspended condition, immensely wealthy and visibly struggling at the same time. They are not always bitter. Many of them love the place with a fierce and complicated loyalty. What they have is closer to a wary watchfulness. The awareness that they are living somewhere that has proven it can be left, and a quiet uncertainty about whether the next generation will choose to arrive at all. And when a city built on the dream of arrival begins to wonder whether people will keep arriving, it has reached the one question a boomtown can never comfortably answer. What San Francisco offers us in the end is not just a story about San Francisco. It is a diagnostic tool, a way of asking, of any city or any place that hosts a great concentration of wealth, the question this city can no longer answer with confidence. Does the wealth actually need to be here? Or does it merely happen to be here for now? Is the prosperity tied to the place, or is it floating above it, free to leave the moment it chooses? Is this a city in its own right? Or is it a host that mistook the presence of its guest for its own permanent good health? The answer in San Francisco is no longer comfortable. The fortunes are larger than they have ever been. The companies are worth more than entire countries. The bay is as beautiful as it was the day the first miners sailed in, and underneath all of it, the connection between the wealth and the city, the physical, daily, street-level life that made it a place and not just an address, is quietly coming apart as the very tools the city built teach its own prosperity that it can live anywhere it likes. Empires do not fall in a day. They fall in patterns. And the pattern San Francisco is following is one of the oldest there is. A place hosts a great source of wealth, builds its entire life around the presence of that wealth, and then discovers that the wealth was only ever passing through, free to detach the moment it no longer needs the host. It happened to cities before San Francisco. It will happen to cities after San Francisco. The industry changes, the skyline changes, the particular flavor of the gold changes. The pattern does not. Tell us in the comments which city you think follows this one. The next chapter of Empire Falls is already being written.